The plane touched down in Warsaw with a thud that felt like a full stop at the end of a long, uncertain sentence. Out the window, the world was a study in gray. Gray sky, gray concrete buildings, a gray light that seemed to drain the color from everything. She gathered her coat, her one small suitcase, and the heavy, silent weight of expectation that had traveled with her from Tokyo. She was 21, a pianist. To the world outside, she might have looked frail, almost severe, with her sharp eyes and a posture that spoke of intense focus. Inside, a furnace of determination burned. She had come for the Chopin competition, an event that happened only once every 5 years. For a pianist, it wasn't just a contest. It was a pilgrimage, a trial by fire that could make a career or break a spirit. The names of past winners were spoken in halls like sacred texts. She knew them all. The city itself felt heavy with history and politics. It was 1970, and Poland was deep behind the Iron Curtain. Soldiers in dull uniforms stood at corners. The air tasted of coal smoke and caution. The competition was a rare jewel the state polished brightly for the world to see, a chance to prove cultural superiority. For the young artists arriving from across the globe, it was a pressure cooker. Every note they played would be weighed not just for its beauty, but for its political correctness, for its allegiance to a certain Polish soul that the jury fiercely guarded. She found her lodgings. A sparse room in a student dormitory that smelled of boiled cabbage and old wood. The first thing she did was find the piano. It was an old, battered upright in a common room, its keys yellowed and chipped. But it was a piano. She placed her fingers on the keys, not to practice her pieces with fury, but to listen, to feel the resistance of the action, the tone of the strings in this cold, foreign air. This was her first conversation with Warsaw. Walking the streets the next day, she felt the eyes. Competitors recognized each other with nervous, fleeting smiles. There were the flashy young men from the West, confident and broad-shouldered. The intense Soviet pianists, products of a rigorous, flawless system. She moved among them quietly, observing. In rehearsals, she could hear the styles clashing from practice rooms. Thunderous, heroic Chopin from one door. Sweet, sentimental Chopin from the next dot. Her own approach was different. She had never been interested in the big, showy gesture for its own sake. For years, she had lived inside Chopin's music, like someone studying a complex, beautiful language. She cared about the architecture of a phrase, the hidden conversation between the left and right hand, the silences between the notes that held as much meaning as the sounds. Her Chopin was not a roaring storm, but a deeply felt, introspective poem. It was clear, intellectual, and emotionally restrained until the moment it absolutely had to overflow. She knew this was a risk. The favorite to win was a dashing Polish pianist, a national hero already. He played with a fiery, romantic passion that made audiences weep and stand up cheering. That, she understood, was what the people and the jury expected. It was the correct Chopin. Her first rehearsal on the competition stage was a shock. The hall was vast, dark, and cold. The grand piano, a magnificent instrument, felt like a living beast waiting to be tamed. She started with the nocturne she would play in the first round. Her touch was light, her tempo slower than most would dare. The sound disappeared into the velvet curtains. A technician in the back coughed. She stopped, closed her eyes, and started again. This time she played not for the empty hall, but for the small, perfect idea of the music in her head. The notes began to connect, to find their space. It was a start. The first round arrived. Backstage was a symphony of anxiety. She could smell the nervous sweat, hear the frantic, whispered scales, see fingers trembling as they adjusted cuffs. She waited, her hands still in her lap. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage with a calm that surprised even her. The lights were blinding, turning the sea of faces in the audience into a dark, murmuring blur. The jury sat at a long table, a row of severe faces, mostly older men. They were the kings of this world. Some were legendary teachers, others were famous performers. Their expressions were unreadable. She sat. She arranged the folds of her simple dress. She placed her hands on the keys and let the world shrink until it contained only the geometry of the black and white notes and the map of the music in her mind. She began dot. It was like dropping a pin in a silent room. Her sound was not big, but it was incredibly clear, each note a polished stone. She shaped the melody, not with a sweeping, dramatic brush, but with the delicate precision of a calligrapher. In the fast passages, she didn't blaze with speed. She revealed the intricate, dancing patterns within. She was not performing at the audience. She was thinking through the music and inviting them to follow dot. The silence in the hall deepened. When she finished, the applause was polite, thoughtful. It wasn't the roaring ovation the Polish favorite had received. But as she walked off, she saw one or two of the younger jury members leaning in, whispering to each other, their eyebrows raised. It wasn't disapproval. It was curiosity. She passed the first round, and the second. Her name began to appear in the whispered conversations of the competition circles. The Japanese girl, they said. So strange. So clear. Not very passionate, is she? But those who listened closely heard something else. An integrity that was unshakable. She wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to understand Chopin completely, and to communicate that understanding got, by the time she reached the semifinals, a quiet divide had formed. A faction of the jury, the traditionalists, grew increasingly wary. To them, Chopin was the heart of Poland, a symbol of national suffering and romantic spirit. This young woman's analytical, restrained approach felt like a dissection of a living thing. It was bloodless. It was, they feared, wrong. One afternoon, after a particularly probing rehearsal of the monumental Third Sonata she would play for the semis, she felt the change in the air. An official, a Polish woman with a tight smile, approached her not with congratulations, but with a clipboard and a grave expression. "The jury appreciates your technical skill," the woman said, her voice low, "but there is concern. The final movement of the sonata. It must have more life, more fire. It is too slow. You must consider the intention of the composer." It was not advice. It was a warning, delivered with the weight of the institution behind it. The young pianist simply nodded, her face a calm mask. But inside, the furnace roared hotter. They were asking her to betray the music as she heard it, to trade her hard-won understanding for a cheap theatrical effect. They were asking her to play a lie. That night, in her cramped room, she stared at the ceiling. The sounds of other competitors, practicing their flawless, impassioned runs, filtered through the walls. She thought of her family, of her teachers, of the years of solitary work. To obey might mean a higher score, a chance at the final, a career-making prize. To refuse was professional suicide. It would be seen as arrogance, and in this world, arrogance in a young, unknown pianist was an unforgivable sin. She got up and went to the common room. The old upright piano waited in the dim light. She didn't play her competition pieces. Instead, she played a simple Bach prelude, its logical, beautiful lines a balm to her soul. As the clean notes hung in the quiet air, her decision hardened into something as clear and solid as crystal. She would not bend. She would walk onto that stage and play the music as she believed it must be played. Let the judges do what they must. The stage was set. The battle lines, invisible to the audience, were drawn. It was no longer just a competition. It was a test of who owned the music, the institution or the artist. The day of the semi-final arrived, heavy and still. The air in the performer's lounge felt thick enough to choke on. It was a cramped, windowless space backstage, smelling of old velvet, nervous sweat, and the lemon oil they used on the piano keys. Pianists paced in small circles, their fingers twitching at their sides. Some sat with eyes closed, humming passages under their breath. Others stared blankly at the wall, their faces pale. She sat apart, in a corner chair that was slightly frayed at the arms. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, perfectly still. Inside, her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. But she had learned long ago that the body could be trained to lie. To the others, she looked like a statue of calm. She was running the music in her head, not the notes, but the shape of it, the rise and fall of emotion she wanted to convey. It was a map she had drawn over countless hours, and she knew every turn, every peak. Every quiet valley. Her chosen piece for this round was Chopin's Piano Sonata No. 3 in B minor. It was a mountain of a piece. The final movement was a particular beast, a rushing, relentless torrent of notes called a perpetuum mobile, a perpetual motion. Most pianists attacked it like a sprint, a dazzling show of fingerwork to bring the audience cheering to its feet. That was the tradition. That was what everyone expected. But to her, that was a misunderstanding. In her deep study, she heard something else beneath the whirlwind. She heard a ghost story. The running notes weren't just for show. They were like a desperate, chilling wind, swirling around a core of deep sadness and unresolved longing. Playing it just for speed, she felt, missed the entire point. It turned profound tragedy into empty spectacle. Her tempo was slower, deliberate. It allowed the haunting melodies hidden in the left hand to whisper through. It made the movement sound less like a race and more like a fate. A competition official with a clipboard opened the door. 5 minutes, he announced, his voice flat. The tension in the room spiked. One of the Soviet pianists, a young man with brilliant red hair, began to tap his foot on the floor. A rapid, nervous staccato. She stood up, smoothed her plain, dark dress, and walked to the small mirror by the door. She met her own gaze. The eyes that looked back were fierce, older than her 21 years. This is the music, she told herself silently. Not theirs, yours. The walk to the stage wing was a long corridor of shadows. She could hear the pianist before her finishing his performance, a booming, passionate rendition of a ballade. The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that crashed through the heavy curtain. The stagehand beside her gave her a sympathetic, pitying sort of smile. Following that act was a terrible piece of luck. As the applause died down, the previous pianist strode off, his face flushed with triumph and relief. He brushed past her without a glance. The stage manager nodded at her. Go. She stepped into the blinding light. The stage felt vast, a desert of polished wood. The black concert grand piano sat in the center like an altar. Beyond the lights, she could sense more than see the audience, a dark, rustling mass of thousands. And to the side, just visible in the dimness, sat the jury. A long table. A row of faces illuminated by small reading lamps. She did not look at them. She sat. The leather of the bench was cool. She took a moment, settling herself, finding her center of gravity. The hall fell into a hushed, waiting silence. She lifted her hands and began. The first movements of the sonata unfolded as she had planned. The dramatic opening, the lyrical second movement, the famous funeral march. She played with a controlled intensity, her focus turned completely inward. She was aware of the absolute quiet in the hall, a good sign. They were listening, not just hearing. She poured herself into the funeral march, finding a depth of grief that was private and immense, not theatrical. As the final, heartbreaking chords of the march faded into silence, She allowed that silence to hang in the air, full and complete. Before beginning the last movement, this was it. The Perpetuum mobile. She started at her chosen tempo. It was swift, yes, but it had a weight to it. It was not a shallow sparkle, but a deep, churning river. The notes were perfectly clear, every one a distinct pearl on a string. The melancholy melody in the bass sang clearly beneath the shimmering surface. She was deep inside the storm, navigating it with precision and a strange, aching beauty. And then she saw it, out of the corner of her eye, a movement at the jury table. One of the older judges, a man with a great, stern brow and a shock of white hair, was leaning to the man next to him. He wasn't whispering. He was speaking with clear agitation, his eyes fixed on her. He gestured with his hand, a chopping, speeding up motion. The other judge, a smaller man with a thin face, nodded vigorously. A cold spike drove itself into her chest, right below her ribs. Her fingers kept moving perfectly on pure muscle memory, but her mind was suddenly split. One part was still deep in the music, riding the current. The other part was now horribly, acutely aware of the long table to her left. The white-haired judge caught the eye of a competition official standing in the wings. He gave a sharp, unmistakable jerk of his head. The official's eyes widened, and he disappeared backstage. A wave of heat flooded her neck and face. They were discussing stopping her. Right now. In the middle of her performance. The humiliation of it was so vast, so terrifying, her vision briefly swam. She forced a breath, locked her eyes on the piano's music rack, and kept playing. The notes rushed on, but inside she was freezing cold. The movement was building to its first major climax. As she approached it, the side door to the stage opened slightly. The official from before reappeared. This time he was not alone. An older woman, the chief steward of the competition, was with him. They stood just in the shadow of the wings, watching her, waiting. Their posture was not of people listening to music. It was of people waiting for a bus, or for a problem to be solved. The message was clear. Asterisk finished this section. Then we stop you. Asterisk her heart was now hammering so hard she felt it in her throat. The music was racing toward a natural pause, a brief rest where a page would be turned. It was the obvious place to intervene. They would step out, hold up a hand, say something kind, but firm about the rules of tempo, and ask her to start the movement again, correctly. Time seemed to slow. The final bars before the rest approached. Her fingers flew. Every instinct screamed at her to speed up, to give them what they wanted, to avoid the confrontation that was coming. She saw her future dissolving in that moment labeled a difficult failure. A girl who didn't understand the rules, her name a cautionary tale. She reached the rest. The final chord before the silence rang out. In that split second of absolute quiet, she did not look up. She did not acknowledge the officials in the wings. She did not slow her hands to prepare for an interruption. With a motion as smooth as if she had planned it all along, she reached out with her left hand and turned the page. The sound of the paper, a crisp rustle in the silent hall, was like a gunshot. It was a declaration. She was not stopping. She was going on. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the chief steward take a small, involuntary step back, surprised. The two officials looked at each other, confused. The jury table was a frozen tableau. And without a pause, without permission, she placed her hands back on the keys and plunged into the next section. She had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The judges had tried to stop her, and the young girl had remained at the piano. The crisp sound of the page turn was the loudest noise in the hall. For a breath, maybe two, there was nothing. No music. Just the shocking, electric silence of her defiance, hanging in the air. In that tiny space between moments. Everything changed. The cold terror that had gripped her chest melted. It was replaced by a white-hot clarity. They had shown their hand. They had tried to break her performance, to correct her like a child who had memorized a poem wrong. And she had refused. There was nothing left to lose now. No score to protect, no favor to curry. She was free. Her hands descended back to the keys. The next notes were not faster. If anything, they were more deliberate, more deeply considered. Before, she had been playing to prove a point about the music. Now, she was playing for herself alone. It was a private conversation with Chopin, in a public hall of thousands. The officials in the wings, the frowning judges, they faded into distant shadows. The only reality was the geography of the keyboard under her fingers and the architecture of the sonata in her mind. She gave herself completely to the ghost story in the music. The running notes in her right hand were no longer just notes. They were the wind howling around an empty house. The left-hand melody was the lonely voice from within. Her slower tempo, now a conscious act of rebellion, revealed everything she had ever heard in the piece. A profound sadness, a restless, searching spirit, a beauty that was sharp and cold, not warm and comfortable. She played with the intensity that was completely inward. Her body was still, her face focused. There were no dramatic grimaces, no tossing of the hair. The passion was all in the sound, a sound that was clear as ice water and just as bracing. The audience, which had been rustling and coughing earlier, became utterly still. You could feel the collective held breath. They might not have understood the battle with the jury, but they could feel the seismic shift in the air. This was no longer a competition performance. This was a statement. At the jury table, the reaction was silent chaos. The white-haired judge sat rigid, his face a mask of flushed anger. He scribbled something violently on his score sheet, the pen nearly tearing the paper. The smaller judge beside him whispered furiously, gesturing with his hands. But other judges were behaving differently. A middle-aged woman with sharp glasses had stopped writing altogether. She was just listening, her head tilted, her eyes fixed on the pianist's hands. An older gentleman with a kind, tired face had removed his glasses and was pinching the bridge of his nose, as if overwhelmed by what he was hearing. The jury was split, right there in front of everyone, and the music was the dividing line. Backstage, the word had spread like a grass fire. Other competitors, waiting for their turn, crept to the wings to listen. They heard the unfamiliar, haunting tempo. They saw the focused figure on the bench, playing as if in a trance. They saw the frozen officials. The understanding passed between them without words. Asterisk, she is doing it. She is actually doing it. Asterisk. There was no jealousy now, only a kind of horrified awe. They all lived under the same fear of the jury's power. To see someone simply stand up to it, not with words, but with the music itself, was terrifying and thrilling. She approached the final pages of the movement. The music, which had swirled and searched, began to find a resolution. It wasn't a happy ending. It was resigned, weary, fading away into silence. She managed the difficult, cascading runs not as a final sprint for applause, but as a dissolution, a spirit finally losing its form and drifting away. The final chords were not loud. They were soft, deep, and profoundly sad. Two simple, quiet notes. Then nothing. Her hands fell softly into her lap. She did not move. She kept her head slightly bowed, listening to the last vibration of the string fade into the air of the hall. The silence that followed was complete. It was thick and heavy. It wasn't the silence of boredom or confusion. It was the silence of people who have been taken on a journey to an unexpected place and need a moment to find their way back. Then it broke. It started with a single pair of hands from the middle of the audience. A slow, solid clap. Then another joined. And another. It didn't erupt into a roaring ovation. It built like a gathering wave. It was respectful, deep, and sustained. Many in the audience were on their feet, not cheering wildly, but applauding with a seriousness that matched the performance they had just witnessed. They had heard something real, and they knew it. She stood up. For the first time, she turned and faced the audience. She gave a small, stiff bow. Her face was pale, drained of all energy. She did not smile. She then turned, as required, to the jury. She bowed again, shallowly. Her eyes swept across their faces, the angry, the thoughtful, the stunned. She met the gaze of the white-haired judge for a fraction of a second. His eyes were like flint. She saw nothing there but cold dismissal. She turned and walked off the stage. The applause followed her into the wings. The moment she was out of the light, her legs almost buckled. The chief steward was there, her face an unreadable professional mask. "You may wait in the green room for the results," was all she said. Her tone gave nothing away. The green room was quiet. The other competitors looked at her as she entered. Some looked away quickly, as if she were radioactive. One, a young woman from Western Europe, gave her a small, firm nod. No one spoke. The normal chatter and post-performance relief was absent. The air was charged with what had just happened. She sat in her usual corner chair. The adrenaline was draining from her body, leaving her shaking and empty. She had done it. She had played it her way, from start to finish, in the face of direct pressure. She felt a raw, exhausted pride, but it was buried under a mountain of dread. She knew how this story ended. In the world of competitions, the jury held all the cards. Defiance was never rewarded. She closed her eyes. She replayed the performance in her head, not the conflict, but the music. Had she said what she wanted to say? Yes, every note had felt true. It was the purest performance of the piece she had ever given. That, she realized, was her prize. It was a private trophy they could not take from her dot an hour later. The official with the clipboard returned. The room tensed. He read out the names of those who had advanced to the final round. His voice was a dull monotone. He read 3 names. The brilliant Soviet pianist, the dashing Polish favorite. A third, a surprise. Her name was not among them. There was a collective exhale in the room, a mixture of relief from some and a strange shared grief from others. She simply nodded. She had known. The verdict was no surprise, but the finality of it still landed with a physical weight. She gathered her music and her bag. As she left the green room for the last time, the young woman who had nodded at her earlier stood up and gently touched her arm. "It was very beautiful," she whispered in halting English. The young pianist managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you," she said. She walked out of the concert hall into the gray Warsaw evening. The competition, for her, was over. She had lost. But as she breathed in the cold, smoky air, she felt a curious lightness. She had carried her musical truth onto that stage and had laid it down intact. They had not been able to make her break it. For now, that was enough. She began the long walk back to her room, alone with the echoes of the ghost story she had told, wondering what, if anything, would come next. The next morning, the gray light in her small room felt different. It wasn't the tense, waiting gray of the competition days. It was the flat, empty gray of something being over. She packed her suitcase slowly, the few clothes and the heavy folders of sheet music. The silence was a physical thing in the room. Down the hall, she could hear the other remaining competitors practicing furious, focused runs on the piano, gearing up for the final round. The sound was like listening to a party she had been asked to leave. She had no reason to stay in Warsaw. Her flight home wasn't for 2 days, but staying felt like lingering at the scene of an accident. Yet, a stubborn part of her didn't want to run away. She had come to play Chopin in Chopin's city, and that, at least, she had done. She decided to go for a walk. The autumn air was biting, and she pulled her thin coat tight around her. She walked without a real destination, her hands deep in her pockets. The city, which had felt so intimidating and foreign a week ago, now just seemed sad and worn. She found herself outside the old church where Chopin's heart was said to be kept. She didn't go in. She just stood there, looking at the ancient stones. She thought about the young composer, far from home in Paris, writing music filled with the spirit of this place. Did he ever imagine it would become a set of rules, a way to judge people? She doubted it not as she turned to leave. She heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me?" It was in Polish, accented English. She turned. A man was standing there, maybe in his 50s, with a kind, intelligent face and a scarf wrapped neatly around his neck. He looked like a professor. "I saw your performance yesterday," he said. His voice was quiet, respectful. "The semi-final." She stiffened, ready for criticism, or worse, pity. He must have seen it in her face. He gave a small, understanding shake of his head. "I am not with the competition. I am a music teacher. I have attended for many years." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What you did, it was very important. It was not just playing. It was a lesson." She didn't know what to say. A lesson in how to fail, she thought bitterly. "Many of us," he continued, glancing around as if sharing a secret, "we hear the same thing every time. Very loud, very fast, very much the same. It becomes a sport. Yesterday, you reminded us it is poetry." "Thank you." He gave a slight nod and walked away, disappearing into the flow of people on the sidewalk. She stood frozen on the spot. His words were a tiny, warm coal in the cold emptiness inside her. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her not as a competitor, but simply as a musician. It lasted only a moment, but it changed something. That small encounter gave her a little courage. Later, she went to a cafe near the hall, a place she knew was frequented by journalists and music critics covering the event. She sat in a corner with a cup of tea she couldn't really afford, just listening. She wanted to know what the world was saying about the competition. Two men at the next table were deep in conversation, their voices low but urgent. They had newspapers and notepads scattered between them. "The judging is a scandal this year. Completely political," one muttered. "The real scandal was last night," the other said, tapping his pencil on the table. "That young Japanese pianist in the semi-final. Did you hear it?" "Of course. They crucified her for it. Cut her straight out." "Exactly. But have you listened to the tape?" The man's voice grew more animated. "I got a copy from the radio broadcast engineers this morning. I've listened 3 times. It's not wrong. It's just different. It's actually brilliant. But it doesn't fit the machine." Her heart began to thump. She kept her eyes on her tea. "The word is," the first man said, leaning in closer. The old guard on the jury gave her a direct order to speed up, mid-performance, and she ignored them, turned the page, and kept going. A low whistle. No, she didn't. She did. It's the talk of the backstage. They tried to stop her, and she just played right through them. That's not just musical independence. That's raw nerve, and they made her pay for it. Naturally. "But you mark my words," the journalist said, folding his newspaper with a crisp snap. "This is the one people will remember from this competition. Not the winner. In 5 years, who will they talk about? The safe first prize winner, or the girl who told the jury no and played a masterpiece her own way? It's a better story. And in music, sometimes the story is everything." The men paid their bill and left. She sat there, the tea gone cold in front of her. Her hands were trembling slightly. They weren't talking about her technique or her missed notes. They were talking about a story, about a choice, about defiance. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of a world outside the competition bubble, a world where artistic courage could matter more than a score. That evening, something even more unexpected happened. There was a soft knock on her dormitory room door. It was the chief steward from backstage, the woman with the professional mask. Her expression was softer now, almost apologetic. "There is someone who would like to speak with you," she said, "in the small reception room. If you are willing." Puzzled and wary, the young pianist followed her. The reception room was a formal, cold space with stiff armchairs. Sitting in one was an elderly gentleman. She recognized him instantly. He was one of the jury members. Not the angry white-haired one, but the older man with the kind, tired face who had removed his glasses during her performance. He stood up as she entered. "Thank you for seeing me," he said in slow, careful French which she understood. His voice was gravelly, but gentle. "Please sit." She sat on the edge of the opposite chair. "I will not take much of your time," he said. "I imagine this week has been difficult." He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep within him. "I have been on competition juries for 30 years. One sees everything. The good, the bad, the political." He looked directly at her, his eyes weary but clear. What happened yesterday was not about music. It was about power. You must understand this. You challenged a certain idea of power, and so you are removed. It is an old, sad story. He leaned forward. "But I want you to know something. In that hall, during your performance, there were 2 competitions happening. One was for points and prizes. The other," he paused, "was for the soul of the art. You did not win the first one, but you won the second." For some of us watching, it was very clear. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, plain business card. He placed it on the table between them. "I am retired from performing now. I teach, I write. If you are ever in Paris, and you wish to talk about music, not about competitions, but about music, you may contact me. What you have is rare. Do not let this experience kill it. He nodded towards the window, in the direction of the concert hall. They are a moment in time. The music is much longer." He stood up, gave her another small, respectful nod, and left the room. She stared at the card on the table. She didn't pick it up immediately. She just looked at it. It wasn't an offer of a job or a shortcut to fame. It was a bridge. A single thread thrown from the world of established artists back to her, standing alone in the ruins of her competition hopes. It was an acknowledgement that she belonged, not to their system, but to the music itself. That night, for the first time since she had arrived, she slept deeply. The crushing weight of failure was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer a tombstone, but a heavy coat she could take off. She had been seen, not just by the angry judges, but by a teacher on the street, by journalists in a cafe, by a venerable old musician who remembered what it was all for. She had come to Warsaw to be judged. She was leaving having been heard. And in the silent, private world of an artist, that was a kind of victory all its own. The competition was over for her, but her conversation with the music, she realized, had only just begun. The flight back to Japan was a long journey through clouds and time zones. It felt like traveling from one life into another. In her suitcase, tucked between her clothes, was the simple business card from the elderly juror. It felt less like a piece of paper and more like a secret key to a door she hadn't known existed. The world at home was familiar, but it no longer fit her. Teachers and friends asked polite questions about the competition, their faces falling into sympathetic masks when she told them she hadn't placed. "What a shame," they'd say. "Next time." They meant well, but their words felt like they were speaking about a different person from a different story. She nodded and smiled, but inside, she was guarding the real story, the one about the page turn, the ghost story in the music, the words of the old man in Warsaw. That story felt too fragile, too private to share. For a while, there was a quiet emptiness. The intense purpose of the competition was gone. The phone did not ring with concert offers. The music world, it seemed, had quickly moved on to celebrate the new winners. She felt adrift. She practiced, but it was different now. It wasn't for a jury. It was just for the work itself, for the slow, sometimes frustrating, conversation with the composer. Then a letter arrived. It was from a small, respected record company in Europe. They had heard the radio broadcast of the Chopin competition. Specifically, they had heard her performance of the Third Sonata. They wondered if she would be interested in recording it. Her hands shook as she read the letter. This wasn't a prize. It wasn't a flashy debut with an orchestra. It was an invitation to finish a conversation. They weren't asking for something loud and fast. They were asking for that performance, the one that had gotten her eliminated. They wanted the ghost story. It took months of planning. She used the little money she had and the promise of the recording to get to Europe. The studio was in London, a dark, cozy place that smelled of dust and old wood. It was nothing like the vast, cold stage in Warsaw. There was no audience, no jury, just a producer, a sound engineer, and the piano, sitting at the keyboard in the silent studio. A sudden wave of memory hit her, the blinding lights, the rustling, the angry faces at the long table. For a moment, she felt frozen. The fear came back, cold and sharp. The producer, a man with a calm voice, saw her hesitation. "We have all the time in the world," he said through the intercom. "Just play it the way you hear it." She took a deep breath. She closed her eyes. She wasn't in a competition anymore. She was in a room where the only goal was truth. She placed her hands on the keys and began, and it flowed. Without the pressure of being judged, the music opened up like a flower. All the thought, the feeling, the defiant clarity she had fought for in Warsaw was still there. But now it was freer, more nuanced. She could take risks she wouldn't have dared then. She could make the silences longer, the melancholy deeper, the wind in the final movement even more desolate. She played for hours, stopping and starting, searching for the perfect take. It was exhausting, but it was a clean, honest tiredness. When the recording was finished, she felt a quiet sense of completion she had never known before. She had said everything she wanted to say about that piece. The record was released quietly the following year. There was no big advertising campaign. It was simply put on the shelf alongside countless other recordings of Chopin sonatas. For months, she heard nothing. She assumed it had disappeared into the great sea of music, a small footnote. Then, the reviews began to appear, first in a specialized music magazine, then in a major newspaper. The critics used words like revelation, startling clarity, a completely new perspective. They wrote about intellectual depth and emotional power held tightly in check. One reviewer ended his article by saying, "This is not just playing. This is thinking in sound. It forces you to forget everything you thought you knew about this music." The recording began to sell. Not in huge, pop music numbers, but steadily. It found its way to music teachers, to students, to concert pianists looking for inspiration. It became a kind of secret handshake among people who loved piano music. Have you heard the Okita recording of the Third? It will change your mind. Invitations began to trickle in, not for competitions, but for actual concerts. Small halls at first, then bigger ones. She would walk on stage, and the memory of Warsaw was always with her. But now it was a companion, not an enemy. It reminded her why she was there. She never played to please a committee. She played to communicate the architecture, the poetry, the story she found in the notes. Years turned into a decade. Her career was not a meteor's flash. It was the slow, steady burn of a star. She became known not for winning things, but for her integrity, for the fierce intelligence of her interpretations. The young girl who had defied the judges had grown into an artist whose opinion mattered. One autumn evening, many years later, she found herself walking into a reception after a concert she had given in a famous European capital. The room was full of well-dressed people, the air buzzing with conversation and clinking glasses. Across the room, she saw an old man. He was very old now, leaning heavily on a cane. His hair was still a shock, though thinner and yellowed. It was the white-haired judge from Warsaw, the one who had been so angry, who had tried to have her stopped. Their eyes met across the crowded room. The old man's face was a landscape of wrinkles, but his eyes were still sharp. He looked at her, and for a long moment there was no expression at all. Then he did something she never would have predicted. He gave her a slow, very slight, but unmistakable nod. Doc, it wasn't a smile. It wasn't friendship. It was the nod of one soldier to another, long after a war is over. An acknowledgement that she had been a worthy opponent, and that she had, in the end, remained standing. Then he turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the crowd. She stood still, holding her glass of water. She felt no anger, no triumph. Just a strange, deep peace. The circle was closed. Later that night, back in her quiet hotel room, she thought about the young girl on that stage in Warsaw, terrified but stubborn, turning the page into the silence. That girl had believed, in her heart, that the music was more important than the verdict. The woman she had become, with a career built on that very belief, knew it to be true. The judges had tried to stop her, but the young girl had remained at the piano. And in doing so, she hadn't just played a piece. She had started a life.